Hello and welcome back to Brendan Moyer's Playwright Corner, where I read plays, poems, or whatever's currently striking my fancy at the moment. Today we're going to be reading the second part of Edward Lear's complete nonsense, entitled More Nonsense. There was a young person of Bantry, who frequently slept in the pantry. When disturbed by the mice, she appeased them with rice, that judicious young person of Bantry. There was an old man at a junction, whose feelings were wrung with compunction. When they said, "The train's gone," he exclaimed, "How forlorn!" but remained on the rails of the junction. There was an old man who, when little, fell casually into a kettle, but growing too stout, he could never get out, so he passed all his life in that kettle. There was an old man whose despair induced him to purchase a hare, whereon one fine day he rode wholly away, which partly assuaged his despair. There was an old man of Thermopylae, who never did anything properly, but they said, "If you choose to boil eggs in your shoes, you shall never remain in Thermopylae." There was an old person of Minety, who purchased 590 large apples and pears, which he threw unawares at the heads of the people of Minety. There was an old person of Deal, who in walking used only his heel. When they said, "Tell us why," he made no reply, that mysterious old person of Deal. There was an old man on the Humber, who dined on a cake of burnt umber. When he said, "It's enough," they only said, "Stuff, you amazing old man on the Humber." There was an old man of Blackheath, whose head was adorned with a wreath of lobsters and spice, pickled onions and mice, that uncommon old man of Blackheath. There was an old man of Toulouse, who purchased a new pair of shoes. When they asked, "Are they pleasant?" he said, "Not at present," that turbid old man of Toulouse. There was an old person in black. A grasshopper jumped on his back. When it chirped in his ear, he was smitten with fear, that helpless old person in black. There was an old man in a barge, whose nose was exceedingly large, but in fishing by night it supported a light, which helped that old man in a barge. There was an old man of Dunrose. A parrot seized on to his nose. When he grew melancholy, they said, "His name's Polly," which soothed that old man of Dunrose. There was an old person of Brumley, whose ways were not cheerful or comely. He sat in the dust, eating spiders and crust, that unpleasing old person of Brumley. There was an old man of Dunluce, who went out to sea on a goose. When he'd gone out a mile, he observed with a smile, "It is time to return to Dunluce." There was an old person of Pinner, as thin as a lath, if not thinner. They dressed him in white and rolled him up tight, that elastic old person of Pinner. There was an old man in a marsh, whose manners were futile and harsh. He sate on a log and sang songs to a frog, that instructive old man in a marsh. There was an old man of Deeside, whose hat was exceedingly wide, but he said, "Do not fail, if it happen to hail, to come under my hat at Deeside." There was an old person of Bree, who frequented the depths of the sea. She nursed the small fishes and washed all the dishes, and swam back again into Bree. There was a young person in green, who seldom was fit to be seen. She wore a long shawl over bonnet and all, which enveloped that person in green. There was an old person of Wick, who said, "Tick-a-tick, tick-a-tick, chick-a-bee, chick-a-baw," and he said nothing more, that laconic old person of Wick. There was an old man at a station, who made a promiscuous oration, but they said, "Take some snuff, you have talked quite enough, you afflicting old man at a station." There was an old man of Three Bridges, whose mind was distracted by midges. He sate on a wheel eating underdone veal, which relieved that old man of Three Bridges. There was an old person of Fife, who was greatly disgusted with life. They sang him a ballad and fed him on salad, which cured that old person of Fife. There was an old person of Shields, who frequented the valleys and fields. All the mice and the cats and the snakes and the rats followed after that person of Shields. There was an old person of China, whose daughters were Jiska and Dinah, Amelia and Fluffy, Olivia and Chuffy, and all of them settled in China. There was an old man of the Dargle, who purchased 6 barrels of gargle, for he said, "I'll sit still and will row them downhill for the fish in the depths of the Dargle." There was an old man who screamed out whenever they knocked him about, so they took off his boots and fed him with fruits, and continued to knock him about. There was an old person of Brill, who purchased a shirt with a frill, but they said, "Don't you wish you mayn't look like a fish, you obsequious old person of Brill?" There was an old person of Slough, who danced at the end of a bough, but they said, "If you sneeze you might damage the trees, you imprudent old person of Slough." There was a young person in red, who carefully covered her head, with a bonnet of leather and 3 lines of feather, besides some long ribbons of red. There was a young person in pink, who called out for something to drink, but they said, "Oh, my daughter, there's nothing but water," which vexed that young person in pink. There was a young lady in white, who looked out at the depths of the night, but the birds of the air filled her heart with despair, and oppressed that young lady in white. There was an old man of Hong Kong, who never did anything wrong. He lay on his back with his head in a sack, that innocuous old man of Hong Kong. There was an old person of Putney, whose food was roast spiders and chutney, which he took with his tea within sight of the sea, that romantic old person of Putney. There was an old person of Woking, whose mind was perverse and provoking. He sate on a rail with his head in a pail, that elusive old person of Woking. There was an old lady of France, who taught little ducklings to dance. When she said tick-a-tack, they only said quack, which grieved that old lady of France. There was a young lady in blue, who said, "Is it you? Is it you?" When they said, "Yes, it is," she replied only, "Whiz," that ungracious young lady in blue. There was an old man in a garden, who always begged everyone's pardon. When they asked him what for, he replied, "You're a bore, and I trust you'll go out of my garden." There was an old person of Loo, who said, "What on earth shall I do?" When they said, "Go away," she continued to stay, that vexatious old person of Loo. There was an old person of Pisa, whose daughters did nothing to please her. She dressed them in grey and banged them all day round the walls of the city of Pisa. There was an old person of Florence, who held mutton chops in abhorrence. He purchased a bustard and fried him in mustard, which choked that old person of Florence. There was an old person of Sheen, whose expression was calm and serene. He sate in the water and drank bottled porter, that placid old person of Sheen. There was an old person of Ware, who rode on the back of a bear. When they asked, "Does it trot?" he said, "Certainly not. He's a mopskin-flopskin bear." There was an old person of Dean, who dined on 1 pea and 1 bean, for he said more than that would make me too fat, that cautious old person of Dean. There was a young person of Jania, whose uncle was always a-fanning her. When he fanned off her head, she smiled sweetly and said, "You propitious old person of Jania." There was an old person of Down, whose face was adorned with a frown. When he opened the door for 1 minute or more, he alarmed all the people of Down. There was an old person of Castle, whose nose finished off in a tassel. But they called out, "Oh well, don't it look like a bell?" which perplexed that old person of Castle. There was an old man of Cashmere, whose movements were scroobious and queer. Being slender and tall, he looked over the wall, and perceived 2 fat ducks of Cashmere. There was an old person of Hove, who frequented the depths of a grove, where he studied his books with the wrens and the rooks, that tranquil old person of Hove. There was an old man of Spithead, who opened the window and said, Fill jumble, fill rumble, come tumble, that doubtful old man of Spithead. There was an old man on the border, who lived in the utmost disorder. He danced with the cat, and made tea in his hat, which vexed all the folks on the border. There was an old person of Dundalk, who tried to teach fishes to walk. When they tumbled down dead, he grew weary, and said, I had better go back to Dundalk. There was an old man of Dunbree, who taught little owls to drink tea, for he said, to eat mice is not proper or nice, that amiable man of Dunbree. There was an old person of Jod, whose ways were perplexing and odd. She purchased a whistle, and sate on a thistle, and squeaked to the people of Jod. There was an old person of Shoreham, whose habits were marked by decorum. He bought an umbrella, and sate in the cellar, which pleased all the people of Shoreham. There was an old man whose remorse induced him to drink caper sauce, for they said, if mixed up with some cold claret cup, it will certainly soothe your remorse. There was an old person of Wilts, who constantly walked upon stilts. He wreathed them with lilies and daffy-down-dillies, that elegant person of Wilts. There was an old person of Pett, who was partly consumed by regret. He sate in a cart and ate cold apple tart, which relieved that old person of Pett. There was an old man of Port Grigor, whose actions were noted for vigour. He stood on his head till his waistcoat turned red, that eclectic old man of Port Grigor. There was an old person of Bar, who passed all her life in a jar, which she painted pea-green to appear more serene, that placid old person of Bar. There was an old man of West Dumpet, who possessed a large nose like a trumpet. When he blew it aloud, it astonished the crowd, and was heard through the whole of West Dumpet. There was an old person of Grange, whose manners were scrubious and strange. He sailed to St. Blub in a waterproof tub, that aquatic old person of Grange. There was an old person of Nice, whose associates were usually geese. They walked out together in all sorts of weather, that affable person of Nice. There was a young person of Kew, whose virtues and vices were few, but with blamable haste she devoured some hot paste, which destroyed that young person of Kew. There was an old person of Sark, who made an unpleasant remark, but they said, don't you see what a brute you must be, you obnoxious old person of Sark? There was an old person of Filey, of whom his acquaintance spoke highly. He danced perfectly well to the sound of a bell, and delighted the people of Filey. There was an old man of Elums, who lived upon nothing but crumbs, which he picked off the ground with the other birds round, in the roads and the lanes of Elums. There was an old man of Dunblane, who greatly resembled a crane. But they said, is it wrong, since your legs are so long, to request you won't stay in Dunblane? There was an old person of Hyde, who walked by the shore with his bride, till a crab who came near filled their bosoms with fear, and they said, would we'd never left Hyde! There was an old person of Rimini, who said, gracious goodness, oh Jiminy! When they said, please be still, she ran down a hill, and was never more heard of at Rimini. There was an old person of Cannes, who purchased 3 fowls and a fan, though she placed on a stool, and to make them feel cool, she constantly fanned them at Cannes. There was an old person of Bude, whose deportment was vicious and crude. He wore a large ruff of pale straw-coloured stuff, which perplexed all the people of Bude. There was an old person of Ickley, who could not abide to ride quickly. He rode to Carnac on a tortoise's back, that moony old person of Ickley. There was an old man of Ancona, who found a small dog with no owner, which he took up and down all the streets of the town, that anxious old man of Ancona. There was an old person of Barnes, whose garments were covered with darns, but they said, without doubt you will soon wear them out, you luminous person of Barnes. There was an old person of Blythe, who cut up his meat with a scythe, When they said, "Well, I never," he cried, "Scythes forever!" That lively old person of Blythe. There was an old person of Ealing, who was wholly devoid of good feeling. He drove a small gig with 3 owls and a pig, which distressed all the people of Ealing. There was an old person of Bray, who sang through the whole of the day, to his ducks and his pigs whom he fed upon figs, that valuable person of Bray. There was an old person of Bow, whom nobody happened to know, so they gave him some soap and said coldly, "We hope you will go back directly to Bow." There was an old person in grey, whose feelings were tinged with dismay. She purchased 2 parrots and fed them with carrots, which pleased that old person in grey. There was an old person of Crowell, who lived in the nest of an owl. When they screamed in the nest, he screamed out with the rest, that depressing old person of Crowell. There was an old person of Brig, who purchased no end of a wig, so that only his nose and the end of his toes could be seen when he walked about Brig. There was a young lady of Greenwich, whose garments were bordered with spinach, but a large spotty calf bit her shawl quite in half, which alarmed that young lady of Greenwich. There was an old person of Rye, who went up to town on a fly, but they said, "If you cough, you are safe to fall off, you abstemious old person of Rye." There was an old man of Messina, whose daughter was named Opsabina. She wore a small wig and rode out on a pig, to the perfect delight of Messina. There was a young lady whose nose continually prospers and grows. When it grew out of sight, she exclaimed in a fright, "Oh, farewell to the end of my nose!" There was an old person of Sestri, who sate himself down in the vestry. When they said, "You are wrong," he merely said, "Bong!" That repulsive old person of Sestri. There was an old man in a tree, whose whiskers were lovely to see, but the birds of the air plucked them perfectly bare, to make themselves nests in that tree. There was a young lady of Corsica, who purchased a little brown saucy cur, which she fed upon ham and hot raspberry jam, that expensive young lady of Corsica. There was a young lady of Firle, whose hair was addicted to curl. It curled up a tree and all over the sea, that expansive young lady of Firle. There was an old lady of Winchelsea, who said, "If you needle or pin shall see, on the floor of my room, sweep it up with the broom." That exhaustive old lady of Winchelsea. There was a young person whose history was always considered a mystery. She sate in a ditch, although no one knew which, and composed a small treatise on history. There was an old man of Black, who sate on a crocodile's back, but they said, "'Twas the night he may probably bite, which might vex ye, old man of Black." There was an old man of Ibream, who suddenly threatened to scream, but they said, "If you do, we will thump you quite blue, you disgusting old man of Ibream." There was an old person of Stroud, who was horribly jammed in a crowd. Some she slew with a kick, some she scrunched with a stick. That impulsive old person of Stroud. There was an old man of Thames Ditton, who called out for something to sit on, but they brought him a hat and said, "Sit upon that, you abruptuous old man of Thames Ditton." There was an old person of Skye, who waltzed with a blue-bottle fly. They buzzed a sweet tune to the light of the moon, and entranced all the people of Skye. There was a young lady of Ayr, whose head was remarkably square. On the top in fine weather she wore a gold feather, which dazzled the people of Ayr. There was an old person of Newry, whose manners were tinctured with fury. He tore all the rugs and broke all of the jugs within 20 miles distance of Newry. There was a young lady of Poole, whose soup was excessively cool, so she put it to boil by the aid of some oil, that ingenious young lady of Poole. There was a young lady of Turkey, who wept when the weather was murky. When the day turned out fine, she ceased to repine, that capricious young lady of Turkey. There was an old man of Peru, who never knew what he should do, so he tore off his hair and behaved like a bear, that intrinsic old man of Peru. And that is the end of Edward Lear's More Nonsense. Join me next time for the third part of Complete Nonsense, Nonsense Songs. I hope to have you back in Brendan Moyer's Playwright Corner.